Hello, everyone, and welcome to Anne Rose's first webinar on the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women Survey, or the NCAS. The title for today's webinar is What the NCAS is, How it's Useful, and What's to Come. Before we begin, I just want to take the time to acknowledge that this is a national webinar and that we are on the traditional lands across Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and also emerging leaders. All of the presenters here today are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the audience today. My name is Violeta Politov, and I work on the NCAS at Anne Rose. And I'm very, very pleased to be here presenting this webinar on the NCAS. We've had a really large amount of interest, so that's been great. We've had over 100 registrations, so we're very, very happy. I also want to take the time to acknowledge the role of Vic Health, who have supported this webinar and have also an incredible legacy in the area of the prevention of violence against women, and currently are doing amazing work in gender equality, and also had led prior waves of NCAS. So a lot of the work that we'll be presenting here today is really due to the incredible work of Vic Health. So with that, I would like to introduce Natalie Russell, Principal Program Officer at Vic Health, and she'll be facilitating questions and doing a bit of introduction to this presentation. And welcome, Natalie.
Thanks, Violeta, and welcome everyone. Yes, as Violeta mentioned, with over 100 registrants for today, I think it's really testament to the level of interest in this program of work. So we've got an exciting presentation for you this afternoon. Before I go through the agenda, I'd like to just introduce all of our speakers today. So we've got 4 presenters today, myself being the moderator. As Violeta mentioned, I'll be the one that will be calling for questions throughout, and also opening up to questions at the end in the last 15 minutes. So you're welcome to ask questions as we move through the presentations. Otherwise, feel free to hold them till the end. We'll make time for questions. So the presenters, first I'd like to welcome Dr. Kristen Deemer from the University of Melbourne. And Kristen will be leading us today through some of the findings from the 2013 NCAS report. We've got Kelly, who will be speaking. Kelly Nagel is the Policy Advisor for PVAW at MAV, and Kelly will be sharing with us some practical advice around how you can use the NCAS results. And then we've got Violeta. You've met Violeta. Violeta will be talking to us more about the actual NCAS survey, the data that's within it, and some of what we can expect to see later in the year in relation to some of the products and reports that will be produced, and then myself. So welcome. So in terms of the overview of the webinar, as I mentioned, Violeta, she'll be speaking first about what is NCAS, so providing an overview of the National Community Attitudes Survey and what data is collected. Secondly, Kristen will be leading us through some of the findings from the 2013 NCAS report. And then thirdly, Kelly will be talking about how it can be used within your work in the prevention of violence against women and promotion of gender equality. And then back to Violeta. So Violeta will be talking about what's to come in the next wave of NCAS, being the 2017 data. And then at the end, I'll be opening up for a Q&A session. So before I hand over to Violeta, just to mention that Violeta and others will be discussing the findings from the 2013 data today. So the 2017 data isn't yet released, will be released later this year. So just so you're fully aware of that. So now I'd like to welcome Violeta.
Thank you very much, Natalie. So I'll just start off by saying what the NCAS is. It is the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women Survey. And it is a survey of 17,500 Australians aged 16 years and over. And it's a telephone survey. So we call mobile phones and landlines in order to try to get a broad representation of Australians across the country. We cover the topics of knowledge and understanding of violence against women. So we've got sort of 4 broad categories, and the first is knowledge. The second is Australians' attitudes towards violence against women. We also look at attitudes towards gender equality and also bystander action. Now, we'll be going through these in more detail as we go through, but just to give you an idea of the broad topics that we look at through the NCAS. This survey is a whole of population survey, but one of the great things is one of the benefits of having such a large sample size of 17,500 people is that it means that we can say something meaningful about groups that are sometimes harder to reach through this type of research. So we also write reports and provide data on attitudes and knowledge among Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, young people, and people with disabilities. So there are reports on each of those groups as well for 2013, as well as the next NCAS. Our focus is, you would realize it's on violence against women, but there are actually a lot of forms of violence against women, as you would know, and we focus specifically on sexual assault, partner violence, stalking, and sexual harassment. So men's violence against women in those areas. So that's kind of one of the boundaries that we have around our work. And our main aims are to benchmark knowledge and attitudes. So once we ask a question, we can then begin to measure over time in subsequent surveys. And if we have a new question, which we have lots of new ones in this coming NCAS, then the benchmarking starts from there. We also, it's very important to us to look at what are some of the factors associated with these attitudes. And we are trying to find different ways of understanding what might be some of those factors associated with those and looking at, in this NCAS, new ways of doing that as well. We also, the NCAS, as you know, it's a survey that's been done over a number of years, it has quite a long history. The first sort of NCAS, although it wouldn't have been called the NCAS, was actually in 1987. It was a survey run out of the Office of the Status of Women, and it was a community attitude survey towards domestic violence. And they ran a follow-up survey in 1995. And the current NCAS wouldn't look a lot like these, but there are actually a number of questions that were developed in those surveys that are still running throughout the current wave. In 2006, Vic Health resurrected it and did a Victorian version of the survey, which was then implemented nationally in 2009. And then in 2013, Vic Health was funded to administer the NCAS as one of the monitoring mechanisms of the national plan. And with ANROS being established as an initiative of the national plan, the NCAS was transitioned from Vic Health to ANROS. And now we have the 2017 NCAS, which will be out later this year, at the beginning of next year. So one of the other important things to note is that the NCAS is funded by the Department of Social Services, and we work with a number of research partners across Australia. Our primary research partners are the Social Research Centre, the University of Melbourne, of which our esteemed presenter today, Kristen Deemer, is one of the CIs of the University of Melbourne, RMIT University, and UNSW. We also have a really robust and complex governance structure, which includes an implementation group which has some of these research partners in that, as well as a project advisory group, an expert panel, a review panel, all of which include practitioners and experts from across Australia, as well as an expert advisory group specializing in working with young people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So that's a bit about the kind of the people that we work with, and it's a very broad group really throughout the country. I also think it's important kind of when starting a conversation about the NCAS to pause and reflect on why we study them at all, particularly because attitudes are not a predictor of individual violence. But at a societal level, attitudes do tell us something about what the community thinks is okay and not okay, and what they're willing to tolerate or not. So in terms of violence against women, it shapes how someone who perpetrates violence might understand or justify their actions, or if a woman will feel comfortable disclosing or might blame herself. I think another really important element of what the NCAS can provide is that it gives a bit of an indication and provides a barometer of social norms. We're all really keenly tuned into what we think other people think and believe, and the acceptability of violence in our culture indicates how prepared we are to accept or excuse it. The NCAS also offers a way of monitoring impacts of investment at a population level. And while the NCAS can't itself say whether one particular initiative or policy has led to change, it does give you a kind of overall indication of how we're progressing and how we're tracking, and also gives a bit of information about where investment is needed most. So lastly, in this sort of overview section, I just wanted to make a note on language, because we use particular language when we talk about the NCAS, and sometimes we forget that people may not know what these things are. So I'll just quickly go over some of these. When we talk about an item, so an item in the survey, we're talking about questions of the survey. The components are basically those grouped themes. So the knowledge component, or the violence supportive attitude or quality component. So those are the elements that we're talking about there. And when we speak about scales and measures, we're looking at a way of talking about, so individual items can sometimes have varying results. So when you put them together, groups of questions together that work as a scale, they can give us a kind of a measure of an overall concept and tell us in a broader way whether people have, say, high support for violence or low understanding of violence, particularly relative to other groups. And we also look very closely at factors associated with attitudes. And these factors are three things, essentially, the way that we look at it. There's demographic factors like gender, age, contextual factors like your occupation, and attitudinal factors. So considering how your understanding of violence might be a factor in your attitudes to violence against women. So that's a bit, that's our kind of whistle-stop overview at the beginning of this webinar. And introduce Dr. Kristen Deemer, who's been involved in the NCAS for a really long time and has contributed immensely to the project. So welcome, Kristen.
Thank you, Violetta, and thank you, Natalie. I hope we get that sound fixed shortly. So I've been involved with the NCAS survey since 2009, so for the last 3 waves. And I've been researching violence against women for most of my research career, and been at the University of Melbourne here for nearly 10 years. I'm going to start by looking at the components of the 2013 survey, kind of the core of the spine of the Violence Against Women survey, the NCAS survey, and look at the main components and some of the results. The knowledge and understanding section is the first section, and this one asks questions to measure the extent to which people have accurate knowledge of facts, or their level of understanding of things like the different forms of violence, such as physical or sexual violence, patterns of violence, such as repeated controlling behaviors, or the consequences of violence, and whether people know where to go for help. We also ask questions about gender symmetry, like whether people believe that both men and women are violent to the same degree. The next segment of the survey is the core of the spine, about violence supportive attitudes, and we have questions in this component around 5 different themes around justifying violence, excusing, minimizing, trivializing, or blaming the victim. We try to get a sense of the level to which people hold different views in across those different themes, and then we use this as a core to analyze all the other questions in the survey. The next section on attitudes towards gender equality, there's well-established literature supporting the association between attitudes on gender equality with attitudes on violence against women. And this section measures support for gender equality in 2 areas. In 2013, we looked at the public sphere, for example, asking whether people believe that men make better political leaders in the public arena, and the private sphere, for example, whether women prefer men to be in charge in an intimate partner relationship. In 2013, we used eight items in a scale. We're really looking forward to the results in 2017 because it expanded the scale to measure additional forms of gender equality, such as issues of backlash. And Violetta will talk about that a little bit more at the end. The fourth section measures the intention to act, or some of the bystander questions, which you might have heard. The intention to act or intervene in response to witnessing violence against women. In each of these themes, there are individual questions, and then I'm going to take you through some of those as key findings from 2013. And following that, we'll explore some of the factors most associated with some of the overall results. I'm going to start with some encouraging results. In the knowledge section, we can see that most Australians recognise the many and varied forms of violence. Their knowledge is not limited to physical assault, and the public is more informed about what constitutes violence against women. That it also a public is more informed about what constitutes violence against women, and the public is more likely to support responses and prevention plans. So we've got 70% who recognize that partner violence is usually perpetrated by men, and most people are aware that partner violence and forced sex in a relationship are against the law. But there's also areas of concern where there's concerning lack of knowledge and understanding. With fewer people believe that violence against women is common than in previous NCAS surveys. There's also a decrease in understanding that women are at greater risk of sexual assault by a person that they know as opposed to an unknown person. And this is a verifiable fact, which some people were aware of in the 2013 survey than in previous surveys. And other things that people were less aware of include the understanding that women are more likely to suffer physical harm as a result of their violence. And when I move on to looking at the component on attitudes towards violence against women, so moving on from knowledge onto just attitudes about violence, when it comes to measuring attitudes, we've seen encouraging results where most Australians see this as a serious issue and few believe violence against women can be justified. We've also seen an increased understanding and knowledge which reinforces positive responses when women ask for help, so that they are recognizing control and intimidation and harassment as serious, and so then that can lead to women feeling more comfortable reporting those experiences. Some of the concerning results around attitudes: there's a sizable proportion of the community who believe that violence can be excused under some circumstances. For example, just under half of the survey respondents believe that rape results from men not being able to control their sex drive. And this belief is troubling because it assumes that rape is unpreventable, that it's the result of a biological drive. There's also a lack of understanding of the complexity women face when thinking about leaving a relationship. We've got 8 out of 10 people in Australia believe that it's hard to understand why women stay in a violent relationship. This sentiment is concerning because it can slip into a blame. Some people can then blame women for staying because they don't really understand how all the different elements that come into making a choice to leave. There's also a large portion of the community who believe that women lie about their experiences of sexual assault and domestic violence in order to gain control over men. When we look at court records, this is actually incorrect, and it fuels the discussion whereby women's claims are not taken seriously. And so when women do raise issues and want to make reports, they can be questioned within the service sector themselves. Now I want to move on to looking at some of the attitudes towards gender roles and relationships, or gender equality. We did see some encouraging results with 2013, and with people supporting equity in the workplace, but also recognizing that inequity still exists. And some areas of concern that the Australian public still has a way to go in accepting women as, say, political leaders or roles such as being a political leader, as well as leaders in the private sphere at home, where 28% still endorse attitudes supportive of male dominance in decision-making in relationships. So when women are not readily accepted as political and private leaders, it further diminishes their equality and makes it harder for them to take control financially and in the public sphere. The final segment of the survey looks at responses to witnessing violence, measures the intention to act against a woman being assaulted. Now, we understand the act of intervening usually requires more than simply intention. Action is usually precipitated by a culture of support to act, that is, feeling supported by friends or colleagues to do something. But intention is usually the first step. And it's encouraging to see that an overwhelming majority, 98%, say they would intervene if they witnessed a woman being assaulted by her partner. In the last two waves of the survey, we've seen a decline in people knowing where to go for assistance for the violence. So even though we've got this intention of people wanting to act when they witness, there's been a decrease in knowing how to get that help, or recognizing that the police response times have improved. And in some states where they're measuring response times, we know that they have been improving. So if you've got an intention to act, but you still don't know where to go, or you don't have faith in the police responding, you may not take that action. So far I've given some results for individual questions. I now want to take you through into another way that we've analyzed the data. We've taken another step forward and combined individual questions into three themes, which kind of overlap the different segments. Well, they do overlap the segments in the survey. We've got a scale on how well people understand violence against women. We've also got an overall construct on measuring the extent to which people hold violent supportive attitudes. And we've got a scale measuring attitudes to gender equality. Responses from each person were calculated into a score for that overall component, and these constructs would then allow us to explore relationships between the constructs and between other segments of the survey, like the demographics. People get a low, medium, or high response, so whether they have low whether they have low endorsement of violent supportive attitudes or a high endorsement of violent supportive attitudes. So showing you this graph illustrates a little bit how we can put everything together. This is the way the construct can be used. The linear regression modeling was used to explore the strength of influence each factor has on one another. And in this particular example, or this model, we're looking at elements which influence people's attitudes to violence against women. So all these elements that are listed across the bottom were put into the regression model, and then we get an estimate of how much each of those items explain when you're looking at the responses to questions associated with the attitudes to violence against women. You see the two columns to the left, the two tallest columns. The first one is understanding of violence against women, and the second one is attitudes to gender equality. So those two together equate to about 79% of an explanation for people's attitudes for violence against women. So how they responded, what their knowledge or level of knowledge, and their attitudes to gender equality explain the variance in the rest of their responses to attitudes to violence against women. All the other items in that graph across the bottom are demographic items like a birthplace, age, gender, occupation, status, employment. All of them individually account for only a very small proportion of the variance in their responses to attitudes on violence against women. And combined, it's about 20%. So we've got what we can see is contributing to attitudes towards violence against women is much more likely to be about their understanding of the issues and their attitudes to gender equality. Those will shape the attitudes towards violence against women. So in summary, when we put all that together, the findings from the 2013 survey indicate that a significant proportion of people in the Australian community hold beliefs that women are partly responsible for being victims of violence, and that's quite concerning. We've still got a strong element of blame. We also have a large proportion of the people in Australia who have concerning views on gender equality and equality in relationships, and have a poor understanding of violence against women. But we also know that knowledge and understanding are key to changing and shifting attitudes towards gender equality or towards violence against women, attitudes and violence against women. So what that means is that attitudes to violence against women can be changed by focusing work on increasing knowledge and understanding both of violence against women and gender equality. We can have the greatest impact for making change. There's also a lot we don't know. There might be quite a few other elements that are influential to attitudes on violence against women. And looking forward to 2017, we've added some new components in, so it'll be quite exciting to look at that at the end of the year. And I think that's pretty much where I've gotten up to show you what I'm going to tell you about with the results. And I'll just leave it there if you've got any further questions. I hope we have sound from Natalie now.
I hope you can hear me. Please let me know.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Great. We can hear you.
Okay, so apologies for that before. Hopefully it's fixed now. We've got two questions here that I'll ask you, Kristen. The first one was, so Violetta had indicated that reports will be available for particular target groups such as Aboriginal, cold young people. And will there be a report around rural and remote communities?
We won't have a separate rural remote communities report. However, all the tables in the report will be broken down by region. So we do, in the previous reporting, we've done rural, regional, and remote. When we'll be doing that again. So all the questions will be broken down.
Okay. And then a second question from Sandy. Given that it's a phone survey, do you have other methods of conducting the survey for those without phones, e.g. for non-English speaking backgrounds?
Okay, all the survey responses were collected by telephone, but we use a mix of landline and mobile phones. And this enabled us to access people who, well, increasingly, more and more Australians are only using mobile phones. So this is particularly important for youth, people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and people in rural and remote areas who may not have a landline, they might have a satellite phone. So it's actually increased our response rate of all kinds of different demographics, population of different demographics. The other thing about the survey doing it by phone, I've just forgotten. Sorry.
It'll come to you later.
Yeah, it'll come to me later. Sorry. Yep.
Okay, that's okay. That's the. We've got one more question that's just come in from Emma. So, what is the sample size for each age group? And I'm just trying to expand that. So, first one, what's the sample size for each age group?
Okay, I can't tell you the sample size for each age group off the top of my head. Unfortunately, I don't have that in front of me. But it was 17,500, and we weighted the sample to the Australian population. So we've got a representative sample of Australia, and it matches the ABS demographic.
Okay, yep. Emma was particularly interested in the youth cohort.
Right, yes. So we have a youth report, and I can't tell you the actual sample size off the top of my head.
Okay.
But
sorry. No, go ahead.
I would say that with our subsamples like the youth and the CALDS reporting and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's report, while we analyze by as many variables as we can, all the questions are analyzed, but in terms of breaking it down and further into the demographic cell sizes are often too small. So there is a limited number of sort of additional demographics that we can break it down by. Say, for example, remote. We may not be able to do that for youth because we don't have enough youth in the remote areas.
Great. Okay. So another question from Sandy. So do you have translators?
Yes, and thank you for asking that, because that was the other question that was what I wanted to say about the phone survey, is that we did have translators. We had it interpreted into quite a few languages. I think there was 7 languages. And the survey, if we had a phone, a landline with an address, we pre-sent out a letter to increase our sample or our uptake of the survey, and those were translated as well.
Okay, great. Okay, just 2 more. The questions are coming in thick and fast now. So just 2 more for Kristen before we wrap up this part of the webinar and move on to Kelly. So can you clarify how the regions would be broken down? So will it be regional Victoria or by each LGA?
Okay, it's we're mapping it onto the ABS regions, and we have rural and remote and metro in each state.
And the last question here was from Karen. It was, is there a view to extend this survey more nationally? But I'm not sure exactly what Karen meant by that.
So maybe it was
maybe bigger.
So we have it is national. We cover all states and territories in Australia, and the sample size is representative from each state, so that we can do analysis for each state and territory. The reporting that we will do is under this contract does not include reporting for each state and territory, but states and territories can request their data through DSS, through the Department of Social Services.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for that great presentation. And we'll move on now. So I'd like to now introduce Kelly Nagel. And Kelly's a policy advisor for preventing violence against women from the Municipal Association. So welcome, Kelly.
Thanks, Natalie, and hello to all the participants today. In this component of the webinar, I'd like to run through some examples of how organisations are using the NCAS findings in their work in the prevention of violence against women. And I may use the acronym PVAW from time to time, so just so you know what we mean by that. So I'm just going to run through a few of the examples of work I'm aware of. By no means is it an exhaustive list of work. There's much more that's out there. And whilst we're really excited about what the 2017 survey is going to be able to provide us in the not too distant future, I think it's really useful to look at the 23 survey results and use them not only in current work but also in future planning as well. So I wanted to start by showing a short video that was produced by Vic Health and the Melbourne University and Social Research Centre.
Right, I'm off. You're the man of the house now. Keep an eye on your sisters.
I reckon Rob needs the job more than Vicky does. He's got 3 mouths to feed.
Why should she get paid to go and pop another kid out when I'm here doing all the work?
Just buy her another couple of drinks and she's all yours, mate.
Well, why doesn't she just leave if he's really a wife beater?
Where were you this afternoon? I called you 3 times.
Authorised by Vic Health, 15 to 31 Pelham Street, Carlton, Victoria.
I think the video really highlights the scale and the scope of effort that's going to be required to end violence against women, and how this effort really needs to occur across the life course and across all settings where people live, work, learn and play. And unfortunately, my slides are not transitioning, so we'll try again. There we go. Okay, the NCAS video has proven a really effective tool for many organisations, including councils who I work with, to build understanding on the links between violence against women and gender inequality. It articulates this link really simply and clearly, which is critically important when you're trying to communicate such a complex message on how social norms, structures and practices to influence individual attitudes and behaviours that lead to violence. It's crucial to firmly establish this link between gender inequality and violence against women with your audience and in developing and implementing informed pieces of work. I've often utilised the video and presentations I do to council when time is really constrained and to build leadership engagement and help support a business case for a new project. The NCAS is aligned to the National Primary Prevention Strategy, Change the Story, which was published in 2015. Change the Story identifies these 4 gendered drivers of violence against women, and you can see how these gendered drivers are reflected in the NCAS questions. And whilst NCAS is a significant piece of research in its own right, it's also a complementary data source that can be utilised in your work. It can provide a greater depth or a broader narrative to the data that may be focused on prevalence or experiences of violence or particular population groups. With NCAS closely aligned to Change the Story, it's a great tool to strengthen and bolster the work that references the framework. And I'd hope that would be most of the primary prevention work happening across the country. And it's certainly the framework in which councils are relying on, basing their work on in Victoria. And I guess I just want to state that we're so fortunate to have such a rich and growing evidence base to draw on to inform our work. It really is world-class practice. In terms of program planning, Tina, could you change the slide for me, please? Thank you. I'd like to share an example of NCAS being applied in program planning that is evidenced by the AIMS Australia project in their PVOR activity. It was in 2014 following the release of the second action plan from the national plan and also the NCAS 2013 survey report that both stated the need to have a focus on culturally and linguistically diverse communities. This ignited AIMS to make a commitment to explicitly join the primary prevention effort. They understood from the NCAS report that CALD women are less likely to report violence. They're also experience more barriers in accessing support and are less likely to leave a family violence situation than other Australian women. NCAS data formed the basis of AIM's successful funding submissions to a group of a partnership of agencies to develop their PVOR in CALD communities program. And I should note that this was prior to the release of Change the Story. AIM started working on a national consultation to develop a national framework, and you can find this online if you search for the understandings and actions to prevent violence in CALD communities. It's a great resource. Recommendations from the consultation also informed the creation of their leadership program, and this involved training members of the CALD community in knowledge and skills to lead action in their own linguistic and cultural communities as well as the broader community. During the leadership course, participants are taught how to use the NCAS data to lead discussions in their own languages and in their own communities and to illuminate the issue based on evidence. They facilitate discussions on the elimination of violence and within specific communities. And they're also taught public speaking skills and media skills to apply their learnings in a broader context. And there were 37 graduates in last year from 31 different linguistic groups. And currently AIMS are recruiting for the 2018 program. We move to the next slide. In education and training, I mentioned earlier the NCAS video that's being used by many organisations to deliver as part of their family violence workshop or gender equity or preventing violence against women workshop. It's a great way of setting the scene and enabling people to engage with the evidence base through an accessible narrative covering significant breadth of the NCAS findings, as well as providing a really important way in for understanding the link between gender inequality and violence against women. Along with the video, Vic Health produced 15 infographics, and these are really useful to insert into slides you might be giving in presentations, and they're really good for highlighting and unpacking the particular issues. And you can also download those from Vic Health's website. One of our local leading community organisations, DVRCV, include an exercise in their training sessions where at the start of the session the participants are asked to think about common myths and beliefs people have about family violence victims and perpetrators, and then they refer back to those later in the session and use the infographics to underscore what contributes to the external barriers that women face in seeking to leave or seeking support. Another example where NCAS has been instrumental is the development of an e-learning module, and you can see that there at the bottom of the slide. That was a project undertaken last year and led by Port Phillip Council with a partnership of agencies, and it's free for everyone to use. It's on our website. The e-learning works to debunk myths around family violence and illustrate the link between violence against women and gender equality. To date, so in the last, say, 4 or 5 months, there's been over 3,000 council workers complete the e-learning, and the pre and post-module evaluation surveys that's embedded in the e-learning module show that there's been an increase in understanding on types of violence, causes of violence, the link between gender inequality and family violence, and people feeling more confident about applying a gender lens to their work. Over 90% of respondents have indicated an increase in their knowledge across those areas. The next slide, Tina. There's some great work happening in the advocacy and communication space. Highlight a couple of websites here. The Line is a website that many people may be familiar with, that it's developed and managed through Our Watch, and it's designed to work with 12 to 20-year-olds. Sorry, I've got a lot of noise happening in my ear, so perhaps the other presenters could mute their microphones. Thanks. The NCAS findings have provided a foundational piece of evidence for this campaign, particularly to inform the key topics the Line would focus on, such as victim blaming and attitudes condoning of violence. Our Watch has since undertaken their own research with young people, with NCAS providing a really good steer as to where they needed to pitch their research, and have been able to target that more clearly. Our Watch are actually in the process of producing a case study that will provide an overview of how the Line came about. So this will be a great acknowledgement of the role that NCAS played in influencing the campaign's development. The other website I'd like to mention is Make the Link. This is a program through a rural women's health service, Gippsland Women's Health, based in the southeast of Victoria. The project workers used the NCAS findings in designing this social marketing campaign, intended to be a starting point to build understanding between the links of gender inequality and men's violence. It's created a space for conversation, reflection, and encouraging people to learn more, become more involved, and to be active bystanders. And they've had actually great success in that space. You can see the NCAS findings reflected in all the campaign's resources, which include the suite of posters and videos that are available on their website, which are fantastic, that really look at the link between sexist attitudes that exist at the heart of violence against women. They've achieved local, national, international audiences through this campaign, and given how little resources they've had to invest in it, it's really a great achievement. It includes Our Watch now using this iceberg image in their new Sport Can Help Change the Story video. Our Watch are also using it in their 30-minute training package they're piloting with 4 national sports bodies at the moment. And then the intention is post-pilot of that training, it'll be online in the Play by the Rules platform, which means it'll be available to sporting clubs right across the nation. They've also had great success. The Queensland Wicked Pickets campaign used the Make the Link resources in their advocacy and to agitate successfully for a change of legislation in Queensland on the Wicked camper vans to ban their sexist and misogynist messaging. Okay, move to the next slide, thanks. In resource and product development, there's a fantastic poster that's available and cards that go with it, Know Your A to Z. And it's just basically an action for each letter that shows that everyone can help to challenge harmful stereotypes, promote respect and prevent violence. The actions are focused on the drivers of violence with the NCAS findings shaping a number of them, particularly those around gender stereotypes and victim blaming. These posters are great for workplaces, schoolrooms, tea rooms, back of toilet doors, or on desk petitions. The A to Z cards, the 26 cards, offer a different prevention activity for each letter, and they are really useful in workshops as an icebreaker or an activity in training workshops as well. In submissions and surveys, NCAS can be used really successfully. At the next slide, Tina, thanks. NCAS data is robust and credible, so it's a great reference to include both in policy submissions and funding submissions for strategy development or report writing. No matter what data sources you're drawing from for your project's evidence base, including NCAS data to strengthen your position on where and why you think the focus of effort needs to be. The survey NCAS is such a sophisticated and multifaceted survey instrument with some of the country's best minds behind its design, development and analysis. So be mindful that the survey is designed for a very large population sample of 7,500 people, and it's designed to be replicated over time. A number of people have said we'll use the NCAS questions in our project evaluation, and it may not be the most appropriate methodology. Just to say, the MAV referenced the value of NCAS in both our submissions to the Royal Commission into Family Violence and to the Victorian Gender Equality Strategy, saying that we would love to have extra investment in the NCAS so that it could be drilled down to the LGA level to, have over time periods inform evidence-based practice and interventions and provide opportunities to measure where there's been a shift in behaviour. Whilst this is not eventuated yet, a number of councils are starting to embed some of NCAS questions into their municipal-wide household surveys or community safety surveys. And so this may result in some compatible local data for future iterations of NCAS, as councils can conduct the survey at scale and over time periods. So as I mentioned, be wary of replicating NCAS questions in your project evaluation methodology, because you will not necessarily see the attitudinal shift you're hoping to extract over the life of a short-term project, or be able to gather the sample size sufficient to produce meaningful results. Make sure your evaluation methodology needs to be fit for purpose. And finally, I've just touched briefly on a number of ways that NCAS has been used in practice. How you use it, Tina, if you could go to the last slide, thanks. How you use it will depend on your organisation, your objectives and the resources you have available. Wherever possible, make sure you include referral information and options in your presentations or your resource development where people can seek help. It's really important that we integrate that into our work. So key points. Remember that NCAS is robust, credible and an insightful survey in its own right. It's also a fantastic complementary tool, particularly for work aligned to change the story or the personal safety survey. Think about ways you can integrate NCAS findings into your work to bolster your evidence base and draw the link between violence against women and gender inequality. For me personally, I'm thinking now about how to incorporate NCAS into some grant guidelines I'm currently drafting, whereas previously I would have just stated applications need to demonstrate an alignment with change the story. However, I realise now that by including criteria around NCAS alignment, it provides an opportunity for applicants to drill down deeper and identify actually what attitudes are at the core of the issue their project proposal is trying to address. My contact details are on the screen. Please get in touch if you want any info on any of the examples here today. And thanks for listening. I'll hand back to Natalie.
Thanks again, Kelly. And over to you, Violetta.
Great.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Back to me. So I'm basically going to give you a little bit of an overview of what's to come in the next wave of the NCAS. And what we've done, I'm just trying to change my slides over. Hey, Kelly, Tina, could you change my slides as well? Maybe the one after that one as well. So essentially what we're doing is you had a look at the 2013 survey, and obviously it's a really great instrument and it's really useful, but obviously like any tool, it could be redeveloped and it can be improved in some way. So what we did in order to try and find a way of doing that would be as effective and powerful as possible is we began by doing a review of the literature and also doing some stakeholder consultations in order to see, where we could strengthen the survey's capacity to measure. So, Tina, if you could change to the next slide. What we did was look at trying to introduce, so one of the issues that with the NCAS 2013 had was that it had a number of items that didn't really measure, the next one, Tina, thank you, didn't really measure, there was a tendency for people not to agree very much. So we had kind of low level of agree rates, which meant they weren't really telling us that much. So one of the things that we did through this review, and we reviewed survey questions from all over the world, was try and find some more sensitive items that would tell us a little bit more about what Australians' attitudes were, which also meant that we would try and find some more nuanced, contemporary items. One of the restrictions around this is just to try and ensure that we can make comparisons over time. So we've tried really hard to be balanced and make sure that we've kept a balance between the new and the old stuff to make sure we can make that change over time. We also sought to ensure that there was the capacity to measure attitudes among our priority populations while maintaining the whole population purpose, which we did through our advisory structure. Improved some terminology consistency and made sure that we had a balance of different types of violence, as well as increased our alignment with Change the Story, which you'll see more in the gender equality component. And we also sought to introduce some new factors, so not just demographic factors, but some additional contextual and attitudinal factors to try and see what is actually influencing those attitudes. So then what we did was take a very large number of survey questions and tested them. So we tested them cognitively with one-on-one interviews with individuals to see what they thought of the questions, if they made sense. And we made sure to have people from non-English speaking backgrounds, young people, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders involved in that. So then we made sure that the questions could be understood as well as they could be across a very diverse population. We also tested the scales to make sure that they were measuring what they intended to measure, and also piloted the survey twice. Also trying to ensure that we had priority populations involved in that. And that's a full dress rehearsal. And through that, you can find a lot of issues that might be going on with the survey. We made some changes and modifications to the survey through that testing process. Then we went to field, and we did have the survey translated in 12 different languages. And also, obviously, we had 17,500. We then did some data cleansing and weighting, tested the scales to make sure that they were sitting well and measuring what we wanted them to measure. And then that's basically where we have been and are now transitioning into analysis and reporting phase, which is where we are now. And as I said before, the launch of this data will be late this year, early next year. So one of the things, and you can find this on our website, is that the outcome of all of this, we created a research framework, a survey framework for the NCAS and what is encapsulated within that. And the spine, as Kristen was speaking about earlier, is that middle bit of the survey components, which basically are the knowledge of violence against women, violence supportive attitudes, gender equality, and bystander action. We also were hoping to include some questions on social norms, but we're not able to do that due to redevelopment time. But we have some beginnings of testing that through this. We've also improved the measurement qualities of the scales and included some new factors. Just trying to change slides. Tina, could you move it forward like 2, maybe, or even 3? We're just running out of time. So I'm trying to move quickly. This one's perfect. So the knowledge component, that's the first component we always speak about. What we've done is we've enabled change over time at the item level and also at the scale level, so we can say more broadly if people's knowledge has changed over time, just at an overall level. And we've also improved the wording of questions related to violence in the law. So those particular questions in that area are a lot more nuanced, a lot more, they give a bit more information about people's attitudes to that, as well as improved questions looking at people's understandings of those factors that are contributing to domestic violence against women. We also made some great improvements to the community attitude supportive of violence against women component. So we've got some more nuanced and contemporary questions. So for example, we have a question now about the non-consensual sharing of sexual imagery. We've increased the number of sexual violence questions and also have incorporated the use of scenarios, which helps with social desirability bias. And those are resulting in some interesting findings. And actually, overall, the scale is showing really good measurement properties. So it's doing a really good job at giving us that overall level for people. The gender equality scale is probably the most exciting redeveloped component, although they're all very exciting, but this one's very exciting because previously it had only 8 questions, and now we have 19 questions that cover a much broader range of topics, and they pretty much all align very closely with Change the Story. So we have questions on men's control and decision-making in public and private life, rigid gender roles and stereotypes, male-peer relations that emphasize aggression and disrespect, and also backlash. So this is something that really improved the ability to use that understanding, the scale of people's understanding and support endorsement of gender equality and how that relates to their attitudes to violence against women. The other element that has been really reshaped substantially in this NCAS is the bystander component. Previously, it asked about whether someone would intervene in a critical incident of violence, whereas what we've decided to do this time, and we won't have change over time for this one, is based on Vic Health's More Than Ready bystander action to prevent violence against women, and sought to get an idea of people's intentions to act, their confidence to act, and whether they feel that they would have the support of their friends in 2 scenarios, in a sexist joke scenario and a verbal abuse scenario, to get a greater idea of how people feel in these situations and how supported they feel to actually do something or intervene in some way. And based on these questions, we've actually developed a measure to test people's likelihood to act. And using that, we can do some more work to see to what extent people's attitudes or their understandings are going to impact on their likelihood to act. I think the next component is around the factors, and this is actually also really exciting. So people were asking about how we're reporting, and we'll be reporting on all the same demographic factors as before: age, gender, postcode, etc. But this time we've incorporated a few new contextual and attitudinal factors. So we've got a measure looking at whether or not people are primarily friends with, socialize mainly with men, mainly with women, or a mix of both, because research has found that socializing primarily with men can have an impact on your attitudes. We also incorporated a measure which tries to see to what extent people have prejudiced attitudes towards people from other ethnicities, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people with disabilities, and people who are same-sex attracted. So trying to see what their levels of prejudice are and how that might be related, and it might be associated with their attitudes to violence against women. Similarly, we've incorporated another measure around people's support for violence in general, see how highly associated that might be with people's attitudes to violence against women. And we've got a much more complex way of looking at workplaces this time. So we'll be looking at, say, the gender composition of workplaces if it's highly male-dominated, and seeing whether that contextual factor, what relationship that has with people's attitudes to violence against women. And these will be really useful for figuring out, trying to assess, whether what kind of demographics to target, what kind of context, as well as what types of understandings and attitudes we need to target in order to change attitudes to violence against women. And I think one of the final points here is about, so we've developed a whole new set of questions for this NCAS, and it's basically, they're tailored questions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and they receive the full set of questions as well as these, so people who identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and they were developed with our expert group of Aboriginal women, and they determined the broad topic and themes. We workshopped the questions and response frames. They were tested with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So that's a really exciting new component of the survey that will be spoken about specifically in the report for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The topics are broadly related to people's understanding of factors that contribute to violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls, and also people's attitudes to reporting violence. And I know that we're a little over time. I'm trying to go as quickly as I can. I'll just say very quickly that we are going to have a detailed methods report, a report summarizing the whole community and subsamples together with a little bit of methodology. It'll be about 100 pages. Summary reports for the community as a whole, as well as the subsamples. But one of the things that people were asking about earlier was whether we can give data on, say, regional remote, for example, and we will be providing data tables for every single item by every single demographic that I showed previously. So there's quite a lot of data that can be gotten through data tables rather than the reports themselves, which pull out the kind of the highlights, but those data tables will give you lots of information about those specific things. And we'll also be developing heaps more comms products as well. So I'll finish there and leave you with some websites. Oh, we could try for questions as well.
I've only got one or two, really.
Okay, great.
I've got one or two.
And maybe we'll bring everyone's panel back on screen.
Okay, just while everyone's coming back on screen, just for a question for you, Violetta. Will the questions used in the 2017 NCAS be made available before the report?
No, they won't be made available before the report. If you do seek that, contact us contact us, but they're not going to be publicly made available. Yeah.
Okay.
They will be part of the report.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Violetta. One for you, Kristen. Yep. Will there be gender stratified reporting?
All the questions, if they mean gender stratified by reporting by gender, all the questions will be, all the data will be available for every single question by gender.
Okay, thanks. And one last one again to you, Violetta, or even Kelly, you might know the answer to this. The question is around examples of where communities have replicated NCAS at a local level. Has this been done? And does ANROS have capacity to support this local level data collection around the NCAS survey?
So I think we definitely have been saying proceed with caution in terms of trying to replicate. It's a very complex survey with a lot of statistical elements to it. I definitely have received throughout the years, like people have emailed me and asked questions about how they could maybe use it for this and that. I think it's something. Usually it's been for individual questions, not about replicating the whole NCAS as a whole. I'm not sure that, I don't know, Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that we would necessarily advocate for doing that. There hasn't been, like, in terms of the NCAS up until now, findings haven't been particularly different based on like state-based. There haven't been great state-based differences, for example. So there's also a question around whether or not it's sort of worth the resources of doing that. I don't know, Kristen, why don't you chime in and tell me what you think?
Yeah, if you go back to the slide that I showed that looked at all the contributing elements towards attitudes on violence against women, demographic factors such as place are quite small in the overall proportion, so less than 10%. So, and that includes looking at rural, remote, regional. So if that's what you're looking for by doing it at a geographic area, you're probably not likely to find much difference. However, if there's been an intervention in different locations and people want to check whether that has influenced change over time, then that's something they could look at. But it would have to be a specifically designed evaluation, and it would have to be over a long enough period of time to allow things to flow through. That's the point Kelly was making, that you have to be really careful about how you apply it at a smaller or local level.
Okay, great. We'll probably have to wrap it up in one more minute. We've just got one last question. I'll direct this at you, Kelly. There was a question around, do you have any shining star case studies of local government programs implemented?
Many. So NCAS has been, as I said, most councils are basing their work on the Change the Story framework and are using NCAS as a complementary data source. And so on the MAV website, there's a whole section of shining examples of promising practice. The Port Phillip e-learning module is a really great example that was developed last year. I encourage people to have a look at that. But on the MAV website, there's a whole section on gender equality, and there's a whole lot of resources that we've produced, that councils have produced, but also supporting research and sort of the broader context, policy environment. People can find things there. But when we surveyed councils, probably about 75% have now got prevention of violence against women as a priority.
Right. Thanks, Kelly. Okay. So I don't think there's any further questions. So before we wrap up, just to say again that this session is being recorded. So we encourage you to share it with your friends and colleagues following this session. It will be made available on the Anne Rose website. So thank you to Kristen, Kelly and Violetta for today. And apologies again for any technical difficulties in the early stages. But thanks again for linking in with us today and hearing all about NCAS. Any further questions?
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.